Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm privileged to be able to serve as a member of the Bill Committee, and it's good to see many of the fellow committee members in the House this afternoon. And I think as I start, I want to just pay tribute to the many excellent landlords that do exist around our country. I appreciate that this piece of legislation is being designed to tackle the worst offenders, but it's worth just putting on record that there are thousands and thousands who do a good job of providing long-term accommodation for many people in the private rented sector. We've spoken before, though, in the passage of this bill, both in the second reading and also throughout the committee stage, of the unintended consequences that are existing within it, and some still remain, and that has been alluded to by my colleague on the front bench this afternoon.
Will my honourable friend agree?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. I think you raise a really important point on unintended consequences, and one of my concerns is that it's really important that we consider our key workers, so our NHS staff and our police, who rely on accommodation that is tied to their employment. With the abolition of assured short-hold tenancies, it's really important that we ensure the provisions are there in order to support those tenancies so that they can continue, so that we can retain and attract much-needed police officers and NHS staff. Would my honourable friend agree with me on that front?
I thank my honourable friend for her contribution, and I absolutely agree with her. And again, that's a perfect example of one of the unintended consequences, which I don't believe have been put in deliberately, but are just one of those things that as a result of this legislation we may well see. The other things are those who are accidental landlords, those who didn't intend to be landlords and are not large portfolio holders, particularly small landlords, and we've already heard from my honourable friend about the challenge that they have for economic drivers, and also the risk of the market shrinking. I know we talked a lot about that in the second reading, but ultimately we are seeing landlords leaving the market, and as I've said before, you know, if there are fewer homes for those people to rent, we are kind of in a worse situation. And that's why I support this afternoon new clause 20 in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner. I believe that the review of the impact of the Act on the housing market after a year is really important to just make sure that we can make it even better, the bill even better than it is already, because I believe it is important to address those unintended consequences. I think we could all agree across this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that that's important given the challenges we've already heard about this afternoon about high housing lists and homelessness that is rife across our country. And it's also important to listen to landlords. So in particular, I want to just draw attention to some of the reasons why I think this new clause is so important. Plymouth Access to Housing, or known as PATH, are a key player in tackling homelessness in my constituency, and they work especially with those who are harder to place into accommodation. Now, they have rightly said that they support the bill in principle, and as we've heard today, large parts of it my side would be supporting too, but they say they support it in a buoyant private rented market, and so their concerns are because at the moment what they see is that the private rented market is not buoyant and that there is already a challenge, and so they are concerned in that respect, hence why a review would be important. They also say that they have, though, received funding in the past to support landlords to stay in the private rented sector. And I would be interested in what plans the Minister might have, perhaps outside of the process of this bill, to ensure that those organisations, some of whom have been worked in the past by honourable members in the room today, might be able to mitigate the impacts of some of those the challenges that might be faced in future. The South West Landlords Association, who I've also mentioned in this place today, would benefit from new clause 20 because it would allow for the assessment of what would essentially amount to a doubling of the amount of rent arrears that can be accrued and the notice required for possession before they as landlords are able to get somebody out of their property. And they're particularly concerned about that for the financial reasons that we've already set out. If you have to wait for 3 months of arrears and then another month's notice before you can remove somebody from your property where they've not been paying that rent, again, for those small landlords and those accidental landlords in particular, that's a massive impact. That's nearly half a year of income that they would lose. And ultimately, it's the luck of the draw, isn't it, Madam Deputy Speaker? We don't know in advance how good the tenants are going to be. So if you have an excellent tenant, it's not a problem, but with a bad tenant, it's not so good.
My honourable friend, give way.
Yes, I will.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She's making a powerful speech. Does she agree with me? The only way fundamentally to secure the rights of tenants is to ensure that buoyant rental market that she's talking about, that landlords want to enter, want to invest in, because then they will be competing with tenants, and the market, which is the biggest and most powerful force of all, will drive decent behaviour towards tenants, because without it, landlords won't be able to gain and retain them.
So I appreciate the point that my honourable friend is making, and I do agree that the market is really important. However, I also appreciate that there are those where the market has failed them. So I think we have got to find a situation where those who are not looked after by their landlords are able to receive support. However, as I've already said, my concerns are that this bill goes too far in the opposite direction, and many good landlords who are there to drive through this market
my honourable
are...
friend, did wait again?
Sure.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I would say, with the freedom on the back benches, I think the last Conservative government got this wrong. And when they stopped landlords being able to offset the interest payments on the mortgage for that commercial asset against their income, it was one step among many which actually reduced the number of landlords coming into the market. And each step along the way, instead of seeking to strengthen the market, successive governments, as Conservative and now, of course, it's bound to be completed by Labour, move against landlords to make it a less and less investable asset. And the only people ultimately who lose out most are tenants.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that ultimately tenants are at risk of losing out if there are no properties left in the market. And that leads me on to my next point, and one of the other reasons why an assessment would be useful in the light of New Clause 20, because we heard during the Bill Committee stage that rural landlords are particularly concerned. We know that 44% of landlords, according to the CLA, are planning to sell in the next 2 years, and only 21 of them are planning to build new properties. So when 90% of those planning to leave cite reforms to the private rented sector as a reason, we definitely do need that opportunity to reflect on this and to see what that impact assessment is going to be. I just want to briefly turn, though, having just set out some of my reasons for supporting New Clause 20, to New Clause 15, which has been mentioned many times this afternoon already, and I appreciate absolutely why it has been tabled in those tragic circumstances that have been laid out. However, in light of some conversation we had in the Bill Committee, I'm interested to see who is in scope to be considered family for the purpose of that guarantor system. It lists out child, grandchild, parent, grandparent, sibling, niece or nephew, aunt or uncle or cousin. A wide, but I think we would all agree, highly realistic view of what family is. However, in Schedule 1 of the bill, when it comes to those who a landlord may be able to house and as a result evict an existing tenant, a landlord is only allowed to do that for a parent, grandparent, sibling, child and grandchild. Now, I raised this with the Minister during the bill, and I know that he thinks that tenants' rights would be hindered if we were to extend that definition of family. However, I do find it puzzling that a very wide extended family is justified in New Clause 15, but not in the determination of who lives in a property, because often those family members may well be vulnerable themselves and needing somewhere to live. So I know it's a niche point, but for the government to say you can't house your niece and nephew, or indeed in the light of New Clause 15, your aunt, uncle or cousin, feels like an overreach of the state. And I think we are slightly testing ownership rights and restricting trust and freedom in society as a result. And just briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you will allow me, I am not a big fan, I have to say, of Amendment 7, where it lists out some very excessive details of what has to be provided in a landlord's register, in particular the name and address of the landlord. I think we all know how worried we are about our name and address being in the public domain, and I think to be expecting landlords who are ultimately business people to do the same is one step too far. I also think we need to look at essentially when their conviction for being a bad landlord is spent, because if they are kind of reformed at some point, I think we've got to give them the opportunity to be able to show that and ultimately provide homes as a result. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, New Clause 6, I'd like to just speak in support of the Honourable Member for Wavertree's amendment, particularly around looked after children, and this came up last week in the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, and I spoke to it. I think we absolutely need to be doing more to ensure that as corporate parents, which ultimately every single local authority is, we act like parents and that wider family. And if that young person needs a deposit or needs some rent guarantee to enable them to get into the private rented sector when other options for housing are not available, that we should absolutely be looking at that. And I'm not sure whether that's going to be voted on this afternoon or not, but in principle, the Honourable Lady has my support, and I hope we might be able to work together on that in the future. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.